Chapter 11. The One Who Got Away. The Dilemma of Ownership. On December 17, 2002, Robert Johnson, a black man, became the principal owner of the Charlotte Bobcats. His successful bid to buy the National Basketball Association team was heralded as one of the most significant milestones since Jackie Robinson desegregated Major League Baseball. It seemed to be the ultimate triumph for black folk in the realm of sport, capping a history of continual struggle from segregation to exploitation. Here, at last, was the final victory, catapulting the level of black participation beyond labor, no matter how glamorous, into the rare air of ownership. Johnson wasn't, of course, a true original. With his purchase, he followed a line of black entrepreneurs in the sports industry. Rube Foster, the father of black baseball, had founded the Negro National League in 1920. Robert Douglas had founded the Harlem Wrens, the first professional black-owned basketball team in the United States, in 1923. Fritz Pollard, the Brown University football All-American, had owned two professional black football teams in the 1930s. In 1989, Bertram Lee and Peter Bino were part of a group that purchased the Denver Nuggets, though Comsat Video actually owned 62.5% of the team. Despite these precedents, Johnson's purchase meant a good deal more. He became the first black majority owner of a professional sports franchise in the high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar area of the sports industry, an achievement signaling economic participation in the previously all-white club of modern sports owners. Had Johnson bought the team a generation earlier, the purchase would have been met with unfettered celebration by the African American community as a breakthrough of monumental significance. "We need ownership," was the cry in sports then, as it was in so many other areas of black life, an acute and chronic quest for a people born in slavery. Ownership was viewed as the logical culmination of the struggle, the magic wand, the elixir to all of our sports woes. At least, that's what we thought, until it actually happened. The revolution had arrived, but, as has always been the case in the topsy-turvy, shape-shifting history of black athletes, the revolution didn't look like we thought it would. In fact, the announcement of Bob Johnson's ownership was greeted with mixed reviews. I was surprised by my own ambivalence. It quickly became clear that while black ownership in the abstract seemed like an unfettered good, the fact that the particular black owner would be Bob Johnson complicated matters. The story of Johnson and BET, the television network he founded that became the source of his enormous wealth, is a cautionary tale about how the forces of race, capitalism, and entertainment can converge in unexpected ways. It also points to the fatal flaw in the theory that merely having black owners in sports would change the game. Robert Johnson was born on April 8, 1946, in Hickory, Mississippi, the ninth of Edna and Archie Johnson's 10 children. Johnson's father earned a living driving a pickup truck, cutting and hauling wood to the railroad yards. His mother, Edna, taught at an all-black one-room school in Good Hope, Mississippi. In 1963, the Johnsons moved north to Freeport, Illinois, where they lived in a succession of old rental homes on the predominantly black East Side. His father worked in a factory and continued to drive the pickup truck, salvaging junk around town. His mother worked at Burgess Battery and the microswitch division of Honeywell. She also earned money as a hairstylist. Whereas his parents, like most black people of their generation, were severely limited economically because of their race, Johnson transformed his blackness into phenomenal wealth. Black entertainment television was Johnson's baby. Started with a $15,000 bank loan. It debuted on the USA Network on January 25, 1980 for 2 hours. Its first offering was Visit to a Chief's Son, 1974, a safari movie that followed a father and son's travels through Africa. An odd start, yes, but the early programming of BET had not yet found its money-making formula. Johnson said of the fledgling BET, "It was uplifting and pro-social, the right kind of thing for us in the early days. Many black viewers thought so too, and eagerly supported a network they believed was, at last, trying to serve their interests." In the network's first year, Johnson set aside $1 million for airing basketball and football games of historically black colleges. In the early 1980s, BET paid $500 to each school for a football game, whereas for the larger broadcast networks, it wasn't unheard of to pay as much as $50,000 to schools for the rights to broadcast their football games. The black college games often featured spectacular halftime shows, another source of cheap entertainment for Johnson. Sunday morning gospel showcases and black music videos also offered Johnson cheap programming that he could use to maximize his profits and serve his niche. Despite his claim that in the early years his aim was to be uplifting and pro-social, his underlying motive was always the same. From one of his white mentors, billionaire media mogul John C. Malone, Johnson learned a simple maxim that guided his approach to business: get your revenues up and keep your costs down. There was room for little else in this narrow commercial ethic. BET was an outfit strictly out to make money. On October 1st, 1984, BET became a 24-hour network, helping Johnson to extend his vision. "Our goal is to make BET the predominant source for advertisers to reach the black consumer." The limit of this vision is all too obvious. BET's focus was to be a dominant tool for advertisers, not a service for the black audience it was delivering. During the mid-1980s, nearly 50% of BET programming was infomercials. In broadcasting hours and hours of crass infomercials, Johnson was clearly not using his tremendously powerful platform to inform or empower his audience. Along with its infomercials, BET filled its programming time with hours of music videos, becoming an important player in the entertainment industry. Mega artists of the era like Prince and Whitney Houston, as well as dozens of other black performers, could be seen on videos on BET at a time when they still struggled to be seen on MTV. Entertainment, in the form of black music videos and Chitlin Circuit stand-up comics, came to be the network's prime identity, even though the videos were increasingly exploitative and the comics were systematically paid lower than their white counterparts. Johnson took BET public on November 1st, 1991, while retaining the majority of the company's voting shares. By 2000, BET's programming was 70% music videos, most of which featured the same set of predictable images of black life. Tommy Boy Records took out an ad that year in the Hollywood Reporter featuring a message that was all too revealing of the image of blackness BET perpetuated. "Congratulations, BET. You keep on shaking it, and we'll keep on smacking it." The "it" is a black female derriere. This image of the black woman's shaken and occasionally smacked rear end is what remained of BET's blackness, and this is the image that the white-controlled Viacom would buy for $3 billion. Ignoring calls of race betrayal, Johnson sold BET to Viacom and used the equity to fulfill his dream of buying a pro basketball franchise. He began BET with a $15,000 bank loan in 1979 and sold it to Viacom for $3 billion 2 decades later. As a businessman, clearly Johnson knew a thing or two. As a race man, his record was also established, and it wasn't pretty. With his launching, development, and selling of BET, Bob Johnson proved that even though race was the means to his fortune, he was ultimately out for himself. Anyone who put any great hopes in him as a race man or in his network as a force for change was bitterly disappointed and perhaps misguided from the start. High expectations were natural, as in sports, entertainment was a field in which black people had long toiled but had never owned the fruits of their labor. And as much as any group of people, African Americans know the power of the media and the potency of images. From Uncle Tom's Cabin to Birth of a Nation, their destiny has often been closely tied to their projections in the American media. Projections that have typically been controlled by white people and distorted beyond recognition. BET was the best shot yet for black people to own their own images in the most powerful medium of all, television. But black America was bamboozled by black entertainment television. The images that BET brought to the screen were reminiscent of those described by James Weldon Johnson when he wrote back in 1922 that the Negro in the United States has achieved or been placed in a certain artistic niche. When he is thought of artistically, it is as a happy-go-lucky, singing, shuffling, banjo-picking being, or as a more or less pathetic figure. Given a shot at reclaiming the black image from this history of distortion and insult, Bob Johnson only proved that a black man could put on a minstrel show as well as anybody. To be fair, Johnson did create a successful business, at least as far as the balance sheet goes. He also helped groom a generation of black executive talent and did satisfy at least a portion of the black audience's demand for more black images on television. In fact, Johnson often proclaimed BET the network of black America. But then, when the time was right, Johnson sold out. He shopped black America's most important media outlet to white people. All of this raises some unsettling questions for those of us who have always dreamed that black ownership in sports would represent a radical gain for black athletes and for black America as a whole. On the multi-billion-dollar plantation of sports, will Johnson offer the black athlete and black America a sense of enfranchisement, or will he be just another businessman out to make a buck? Where is Johnson's true allegiance? Is the core of his being black or green? I wanted to get answers to these questions from the source, and Bob Johnson graciously took time to meet me one afternoon in New York for a stroll through the minefield of race and capitalism. I'm a businessman first. That's the first foot on the ground, Johnson explained during our interview. I come at it, owning an NBA franchise, as a business. That's where I initially come at it. I didn't invest $300 million just to say I'm an owner. I invested in it to say I am an owner with the chance to have a business proposition in sports. But herein lies the contradiction. For all of Johnson's green-first orientation, he also stands ready to use race to his advantage whenever possible, especially in an industry dominated by African American players. Johnson believed that his black roots would give him a competitive edge, particularly when it came to the traditionally vexed relationship between owner and player. This is what I'm hoping, Johnson said. I think if you're black and you believe in your blackness or the importance of racial pride, you will do something just a little bit harder working in a black organization, or for somebody black if you respect that person. And it will show up just a little bit, because you'll think, we're in this together. As a black man out here trying to do something, I'm a black player playing for a black man. I can't let him down. My hope is that it translates into a little bit more hustle, a little bit more aggressiveness, a little bit more behavior modification. If 8 out of 14 guys feel that way, then they have an impact on the city. If you get a balance of the players playing for the Charlotte Bobcats feeling that they're playing for racial pride, it might make a change. Johnson also believes that race might offer a slight advantage when it comes to recruiting players. I think there are some who might say, everything being equal, I'd love to work for him, Johnson said, and maybe someone will do what Carl or Peyton did. But they did it to get a ring. He met basketball legends Karl Malone and Gary Payton, who took pay cuts to play for the Los Angeles Lakers in hopes of getting the championship ring that would crown their Hall of Fame careers. If Malone and Payton, prominent African American stars, would take less money to make a championship run, then What are the possibilities of star black basketball players coming to play with the Bobcats out of a deep sense of racial pride? One thing they are going to know when they come here: this team is owned by black people, Johnson said. This potential to get players to play for something other than their next check or personal pride, to believe they're playing for a higher cause, is what Bob Johnson brings to the table as a majority owner in the NBA. The idea that race can be a catalyzing force is very seductive, conjuring visions of a team that consciously represents the best of black America. This notion of athletes being driven by race is an old idea, one that stretches back through the history of sports in America, but one that normally applied to individual athletes, particularly boxers, from Jack Johnson to Joe Louis to Muhammad Ali. Great black hopes took on the burden, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, of being symbols for the race. But this sort of symbolic representation would be particularly potent if applied to an entire organization, from the owner to the management to the players. It wouldn't just represent black individual prowess, which has been on display for hundreds of years, but the power of a black collective. Johnson clearly senses that it's an idea that some players might find desirable, but he never publicly embraces the idea with all of its complicated ramifications. Instead, he hints at it in a savvy effort to exploit the potential desire of black players to play for a quote-unquote black team that represents black America. And he never suggests that a black team would orient or organize itself differently from a white team, never suggests that it offers a chance to overturn the exploitative model of professional sports. Johnson also used race to persuade NBA owners to award him a franchise in the first place, choosing his bid over that of a group led by Larry Bird. The ownership council during his presentation asked Johnson if he felt diversity mattered. Naturally, he told them yes. Given the nature of your business, Johnson remembers telling the council, if you're going to have any future, then you cannot ignore diversity as an issue. Johnson was here referring both to the racial makeup of the league and the potential for increasing the minority fan base of the league. He could also have been referring to the fact that the league's promotional idiom, its slogans and commercials, the musical soundtrack that accompanies the game at arenas and on television, is largely taken from contemporary urban black culture. He went on, if Bird had put up $300 million and I put up $300 million, they still would have had to pick me, under my definition, because otherwise they're saying, if there's going to be a jump ball with white folks, then white folks will always get it, because we made the decision to give it to them. Our bids were the same amount of money, and he's a basketball legend. Yeah, okay, but 75% of your players are black now. In other words, Johnson used the racial makeup of the league and of the country to muscle his way into the owner's box of the NBA. He clearly leveraged not just his race as an individual, but a whole race of people to get his franchise. And as noted, he expects his race to give him some advantage in recruiting and getting the most out of his talent. So now, does Bob Johnson owe anything to those people? Those $35 million who helped him score a $300 million deal? Apparently, the answer is yes and no. One is you have to succeed at what you're doing, Johnson said. I guess I'm saying the obligation you owe is to build up a dynamic of success to the point where the debate goes away. So it's no longer, we got to give you the opportunity because you're black. Now it's, we have to give the opportunity to you because you're just good. You got to get to the point where American Express CEO Ken Chenault can walk into American Express and there ain't no leverage point. You can't say, well, gee, you know half our card users are black and we got to do this. You got to say, we need the best guy, and the best guy is Ken Chenault. Johnson seems caught up in his own nimble footwork here. In this bid for an NBA team, he essentially believed that the league should give him a team because of his blackness, while at the same time arguing that his ultimate goal was to help create a world that would award people based strictly on ability. Johnson has proven himself an able moneymaker, but that ability wasn't enough for him to gain admittance to the ownership level of the NBA. For that, he banked on his blackness. So the question remains, what can he do to pay back the debt in the short term? One answer is that he could think about the franchise not merely as his possession, but as a joint possession, partly his, partly that of the black folks he leveraged to get the franchise. Of course, the same could have been said about his television network. So when it came to BET, why did Johnson feel he had to sell to a white person after having built up the company on the goodwill and economic power of black America? How could he have handled it differently and respected the equity that black people had in the business? One possibility is that Johnson could have sold BET to a black investor for less money, for less of a profit, in order to satisfy the quote-unquote debt for leveraging the undocumented black masses. He leveraged black folks to help create a $3 billion asset. Of course, much of that value came from the work of Johnson and others, but how much of that was due to black leverage? Pick a number, say 600 million. So that 600 million ain't Bob Johnson's, it's ours, right? What you're saying is that I take the $600 million hit to keep it in black hands, and that's the way I'm returning back to the undocumented investors, black people, their own assets by keeping it back in black hands, Johnson responded. You could then argue that you're passing on an asset that will then always be in the hands of black people. Berry Gordy could have done the same thing at Motown. So far, so good. But black-built assets leveraged on black culture and the legacy of the black experience, always seem to end up in white hands with no payback to the black people who supported the company. Why? The problem, Johnson says, is that first you got to find somebody willing to pay. And you got to have confidence that they're going to run it almost like a trust, as a custodian for black people. That is very hard to do. And it's almost impossible to do if you have white investors in your business. Of course, Johnson is right. He could have gone to John Malone of TCI with his idea to sell BET at a lower price for, quote-unquote, the cause. Malone would have told him to jump in the lake. And there isn't a gang of black investors ready to fill the gap to support black-owned organizations, a problem that stems, ironically, from the success of integration. Integration weakened the collective resolve of African Americans and spawned a mentality which Johnson mastered, of using blackness as a way to get a piece of the pie without necessarily feeling any reciprocal responsibility to sustain black institutions. This mentality was the natural outcome of a half-finished mission. Integration, while never truly complete, led to the splintering and tearing apart of black institutions and culture, making it difficult for African Americans to move in a concerted fashion. Without the collective spirit of institutions, black people are left wandering as individuals. "You're preaching from my script," Johnson said in agreement. "The cost of integration can be measured in the decline of black economic power in some sense. Jackie Robinson, not to blame Jackie for this, but the fact that he went to say, 'I want to play for the white man,' that basically destroyed the Negro Leagues because everybody else said, 'The ice is colder over there,' which it was. 'The water is good.' But the result was that black institutions were destroyed as each individual sought to improve his personal lot. Johnson claims he found himself in the same situation. Look at Motown," he went on. "Motown developed artists. When their contracts would come up, some of them would say, 'I love you, it's been good, but I'm going over here to take this big check.' Now you can sit back and say, can I blame a black person? I got the same thing when I sold BET to Viacom. One columnist wrote, 'Bob Johnson sold BET to Viacom for $3 billion, And guess what, folks? He didn't even get money for it. He got paper stocks for it. But the point was, when I looked out, there was nobody out there to write a check for $3 billion. This dilemma runs close to that expressed by James Semler, a black team owner in the original Negro Leagues, when he was forced to sell the New York Black Giants to Nat Strong, a white man. While many fans were disappointed, Selmer explained, "We needed cash and couldn't get it from any colored businessman, so we borrowed it from Strong." That was 1933. Not much seems to have changed. A businessman first, Johnson sometimes gives voice to his visionary side. Before I sold BET to Viacom, I wanted to merge BET with Radio One, with the Black Radio Company, and that to me would have been a major development that would have created overnight about an $8 billion black-owned company with tremendous cash that would have been coming off the radio and the tremendous ability for a radio network to cross-promote the TV to cross-promote the radio. A tremendous footprint for entertainers to reach their audience. A tremendous footprint for politicians to reach their audience. The economic and political might of it would have been awesome. You could have said, let's start a movie company because we've got a way to promote and market it. Let's start our own record company because we got a way to promote and market it. Let's start our own black national newspaper because we got a way to promote and market it. Johnson said the merger never took place. The young guy who owns the other business didn't want to see himself under my shadow. It wasn't right for him. It's clear that on some level Johnson understands the concept of the debt, paying what you owe to a history of struggle that got you where you are today, and to the struggling population that justifies your position. Now that he's entered into this new arena of sports, how will he respond to the debt? How will he repay a history of struggle? Another answer is to offer opportunities to other black people that they might not have had at a white-run organization. And Johnson has done that to some degree, just as he did at BET. Johnson filled his executive ranks at the Bobcats with African Americans. His first significant hires were two black men with strong credentials, Ed Tapscott, the team president, and Bernie Bickerstaff, the general manager and head coach. Bickerstaff grew up in Kentucky under strict segregation. "When I got on the bus, I went straight to the back," he said. "I didn't even think about it because that's what my grandparents did." Bickerstaff entered the NBA in 1973 as an assistant to K.C. Jones with the Washington Bullets. He spent 12 years with Washington, and in 1985, he replaced Lenny Wilkens as coach in Seattle. Bickerstaff was eventually hired by Wes Unseld as coach of the Bullets and was soon thereafter fired by Unseld, who at the time was one of the league's few black general managers. At 46, the erudite Tapscott has credentials any corporation, especially a sports franchise, might covet. A bachelor's degree in political science from Tufts, a law degree from American University. Tapscott served as head coach at American for 8 seasons, followed by 8 seasons as a VP with the New York Knicks. He worked with general manager Ernie Grunfeld to recast the Knicks as a younger, more athletic team that came 3 victories short of a National Basketball Association championship. In a political shakeup that saw Grunfeld fired, Tapscott lost out, and in 1999 found himself passed over as president of the New York Knicks in favor of Scott Layden, although Tapscott was thought to be the leading candidate. 3 years later, Bob Johnson gave Tapscott his second chance in the executive suite. Johnson believes that the example of his ownership will provide broader opportunity for people in the NBA. As Johnson has pointed out, his ownership has made him a role model. You're seeing it now. Jay-Z wants to spend his money being part of the Nets. And you'll see more and more of these young brothers who come up and want to be in sports because they like the feel of it, and they want to have an impact over time. Soon, you'll see younger guys coming in the league as owners, and you've seen it already, the guys in Boston. They bring in Doc Rivers, no? And you see this guy, Bruce Ratner, is taking the Nets. He brings in Jay-Z, hip-hop guy. You know they swirl around with black business folk, and that's going to have an impact on the players. So that if Jay-Z sees other players and they're talking about ownership issues or player contracts, I guess they'll figure, Jay-Z, y'all got to take care of us. And to the extent Jay-Z can sense a reason and say, look, we'll be reasonable and y'all be reasonable. Maybe you get a deal. That to me is the most interesting dynamic. To his great credit, Bob Johnson's rise to wealth has been characterized by his serving as a model for other entrepreneurs while also opening the doors for other black executives. This is progress and is one of the most commonly touted benefits of black ownership. But why doesn't it feel like enough? Why does Johnson's seizing control of an NBA franchise not feel like the exciting culmination of all these years of struggle? The Bob Johnson story tells us something very important. Simply being black is not nearly enough to carry on that legacy. A black man can move the ball forward for himself or even for a handful of others, but to become a genuine force for change, he has to act in the best tradition of that history, while seeking to learn from its mistakes. The legacy of that historical search for power is perhaps a simple one that Tom Molyneux should have understood, standing in the squared circle in the center of a crowd howling for his blood on that winter's day over a century ago. Keep fighting till you win. At every juncture in the struggle, black athletes have fought hard and then let their guard down when they thought victory was in their grasp. Inevitably, that moment of lapsed vigilance was all the opening the opposition needed to strike back. Black athletes have fallen prey to this again and again. When black athletes secured a toehold in the earliest versions of organized sports in America, in baseball and horse racing and cycling, they settled for individual success rather than trying to use what power they had to remake a system to ensure fairness and the possibility for future success. The Negro Leagues were undermined when Rube Foster died because he was the visionary who understood that temporary individual successes weren't enough if they weren't accompanied by new institutions to ensure the perpetuation of that success. Black style, for all of its revolutionary power, failed as a true revolutionary force because no systems were put into place to make sure that style, the style created by a whole people, wouldn't simply be ripped off for the enrichment of a few. And integration ended up merely allowing black athletes to join in a corrupt, unfair system. Visionaries like Curt Flood made the connection. Flood understood that it wasn't enough to be allowed to play the game, but that history and the legacy it offered demanded that he fight to change the system, not just buy into it. And now we have a black owner. But without a full reckoning with history and its lessons, even a black owner is susceptible to the usual isolation and backlash. Buying in is only the beginning. The key is to transform, to make something newer, fairer, more just, something that responds to the demands of the chorus of history, to create something new, to change the game. Epilogue. Making the open shot. For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that the tender branch thereof will not cease. Job 14:7. On September 18, 2005, a group of current and former players representing the National Basketball Association and the Women's National Basketball Association traveled to Mississippi to view the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. The trip was arranged by the NBA Players Union, but initiated by the players themselves. I drove from New York to Mississippi, not as part of any assignment for the New York Times, but to see the devastation firsthand and deliver some supplies. The caravan began in Jackson with a news conference. Afterward, players mixed easily with fans and posed for photos and signed autographs. The next stop was Hattiesburg, where players held another press conference and helped unload trucks and distributed supplies. It wasn't until the caravan headed toward Gulfport that the magnitude of Katrina began to hit home. The players slowly got off the bus and stared at what used to be a Las Vegas-like strip, once glitzy and glowing and crammed with tourists. The entire coast had been reconfigured. Casinos that had sat on barges had been lifted out of the water and slammed to the shore. The back of one casino had been ripped off and blown 2 blocks away, and now sat in the middle of a highway. Trucks that loaded and unloaded ships from ports across the highway were twisted in a heap 100 yards from where they had been parked. The most overriding sensation was the smell. The stench of rotting carcasses was something that television images could not convey. The flood of 2005, which had called for, in the words of FEMA, the biggest single disaster response in our nation's history, was a wake-up call for a global audience, those who were washed away as well as those who watched. The disaster awakened us to harsh realities of the widening gap between rich and poor. More than the event itself, the reaction to the disaster became the focus of debate and controversy. Some victims complained of feeling like foreigners in their own land. Horrifying images underscored the reality that there are multiple tiers of life in America. The images of death, desperation, hopelessness, and poverty flushed into full view made many of us wonder where this America had been hiding. We did not recognize it. Some of us did not even realize this America existed. The hurricane was also a wake-up call for this group of NBA athletes, because the hardest hit were black and poor, many of them having stayed behind because they could not evacuate. They lacked the transportation and money needed to leave. Many of the athletes were raised in Mississippi and other parts of the South. They knew firsthand what it meant to live by a slender thread. Justin Reed, a forward for the Boston Celtics, said he saw himself in the faces of young storm victims. "I come from a single-parent home, and once upon a time we were homeless," he said. "I know how hard it is to start from scratch, to have to build and wonder if you're ever going to be able to live like you once lived. I feel what they're going through because I came from a path like that." As we started out at the Gulf, for a split second, I felt as though I was standing on the banks of the Jordan River, looking over the Promised Land. Earlier in the afternoon, Sharif Abdur-Rahim, one of the Sacramento Kings, and Allen Houston, the former Knick, sat at a table discussing the crisis, as well as the dilemma of leadership among African-American athletes. What was needed at this moment of crisis was a galvanizing figure who could lead athletes to mobilize, rally, and execute a collective plan of action. But who might that be? Abdur-Rahim felt he was too young and didn't have the respect. They needed a Michael Jordan-type figure to captain the troops, to say, "This is the plan, I'll lead the way." As deep and rich as their history has been, black athletes have failed to produce a leader who understood the potential of this black athletic nation to join in the larger push for freedom. That's because in their own world, by their own definition, black athletes already were quote-unquote free. Unfortunately, the terms of liberation have always been defined by the white men who were responsible for the wealth. When Pharaoh defines your promised land, you can bet you'll never reach it. There was a flurry of individual initiatives, donations, contributions. Individual players performed good deeds in the wake of the storm. Most participated in a number of commendable initiatives, from buying books to buying groceries, through their various foundations. But no one could galvanize the collective power of African American professional athletes to create a more far-reaching initiative. The question remains, who will step up and take the shot? What Katrina illustrated quite graphically was that the economic problems confronting communities from which many professional athletes come are too large for one foundation to solve. If players hope to make an impact, the principle they apply to basketball must also be applied to the arduous process of rebuilding communities. Teamwork, Much can be done when you pull together as a group rather than trying to do it as an individual, said Eric Dampier, the Dallas Maverick center. Though this time it's going to be very important for us to pull together as a group. The Mississippi excursion was a good gesture, but by the end of the year, with the NBA and NFL seasons in full swing, the immediacy of the disaster, the sights, sounds, and smells of misery began to fade. Where do we go from here? The journey of black athletes has been an exercise in overcoming obstacles and confronting paradoxes. The obstacle part of the journey has been well documented. Less attention has been paid to the paradoxes. The paradox for this contemporary tribe of black athletes is, how do I simultaneously move as an individual and move as part of a group? A more fundamental question is, what constitutes winning for African American athletes in the 21st century? The question is as complicated as asking what constitutes being African American in the 21st century. This was a simple question 50 years ago, when African Americans of all colors and at all levels of wealth and education were largely excluded, marginalized, not even allowed to compete on the same field as white men and women. For my grandparents born in the 19th century, winning meant survival. For my parents' generation, the generation of Jackie Robinson, winning was gaining access. After access came a fair chance and real opportunity. Winning was Jackie Robinson's historic breakthrough on the grand stage of Major League Baseball. Winning was Althea Gibson's back-to-back victories at Wimbledon, Wilma Rudolph's 3 gold medals at the 1960 Rome Olympics. For African Americans, the promised land has been a movable goal that changes shape from decade to decade. The promised land was a scholarship to a big white school and a fat pro contract. For those of us who make our living in athletics, the promised land mistakenly has become lifestyle, high-profile employment, and prestige. The challenge of the first part of the 21st century is how to convert all of our accumulated wealth and presence into power. In the 21st century, winning for African Americans in the field of sport and play, from athletes and agents to journalists and executives, means extending the reach of power beyond the courts, fields, and diamonds. Winning means ownership, owning teams, owning networks, owning the means of communication, and owning our collective image. The challenge for African American athletes in the 21st century, with unprecedented resources at their disposal, is building on the foundation, expanding, and, most difficult of all, working as a team to create a new promised land. This, of course, is the question of the century, the question of every century for African Americans in and out of sports. Where is the next promised land, and how do we reach it? The first step toward harnessing the cultural and economic power of black athletes is forming a coherent association of professional African American athletes. There are organizations for every other type of black professional: physicians, accountants, journalists, attorneys, but there has never been a national organization of African American athletes. An association would provide links and affiliations, set agendas, and define parameters. An association of professional African American athletes, like all professional organizations, would solidify a presence that has built over decades, framing issues, coordinating initiatives, and helping define what, in fact, it means to be a black athlete. The late Arthur Ashe predicted that African American athletes would play a pivotal role in shaping a society in which they'd command an increasingly viable presence on the global landscape. Ashe constantly preached that African American athletes had to stop hiding from their responsibility to address hard social issues. He chided Michael Jordan for his neutrality on social issues, and scoffed at the excuse that high-profile athletes who remained silent were actually working for change behind the scenes. Backstage isn't that large. The Black Coaches Association was formed in the early 1980s by a handful of assistant basketball coaches. The BCA's original mission was to push African Americans for head coaching jobs in an industry where black men and women were dominant as players but nothing more. After substantial growing pains, the BCA expanded to include every aspect of the intercollegiate sports industry, from coaching to administration to gender issues facing African American women. An association of black professional athletes, whatever its mission, would potentially become one of the strongest associations in sports. Such a group would galvanize the power of a rich past and a prosperous present and figure out a plan for the future. Historian John Hope Franklin doesn't think sports will ever be the promised land for African Americans. I spoke with Dr. Franklin in January 2005 on the eve of his 90th birthday. He has lived much of the history covered in this book. He was born in 1915, the year that Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, lost his title to Jess Willard. Dr. Franklin was 4 years old in 1919 when Rube Foster founded the Negro National League, which gave black baseball players a home. He was 33 years old when Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball with instructions from Branch Rickey to, quote, turn the other cheek. He was 89 in November 2004 when black NBA players roared into the stands in Detroit and pummeled abusive white fans after a player was hit with a flying cup. He's seen black athletes go from pariahs to humble servants to outrageous millionaires. This has been quite a remarkable arc, but Dr. Franklin doesn't think it marks progress. In fact, Dr. Franklin, Professor Emeritus at Duke University, feels that sports has become something of a mirage, creating opportunity on the one hand, but also creating the illusion that things are much better for black America than they really are. In fact, their prominence obscures the dire predicament of black Americans in the United States. There was always a time when society could absorb a select number, a small number, which would be the exception that proved the rule. You still have more black men in jail than you've got in college. Where are they in terms of income? Where are they in terms of privilege? Where are they in terms of just being able to make it in our society? It's awful, he said. It is distressing. So we have to put this in perspective. I know that blacks have risen in basketball, football, and so forth, but they still are the exception that proves the rule. I get more pessimistic the longer I live. Still, Dr. Franklin ended on a note of hope. In the end, I have to be optimistic or else you can't get up in the morning and get through the day. I have developed a capacity to make myself feel that things are going to be all right. Even if deep down I may have some doubts, I have to believe that they are going to be better. In fact, the element that links black athletes through time is the legacy of hope. This has been the black athlete's primary contribution to the journey of African Americans, providing a source of hope, a beacon of light. Jack Johnson gave the community joy and defiance. Joe Louis gave the community hope with knockout boxing victories. Jackie Robinson provided the metaphor of access and opportunity. Muhammad Ali provided inspiration with his conviction. The dominance of Venus and Serena Williams in tennis provided a glimpse into the power of self-definition. Hope, that glimmer of faith in the new day, has been the thread that has guided African Americans through a journey of 400 years. Historian Roger Wilkins eloquently spoke about hope and African Americans a few years ago when he was asked on what he based his own sense of hope. It's based in part on some of my black ancestors who never drew a free breath in their lives, but who believed there was going to be a future, that it was going to be better, he said. And they held themselves together and they passed on values even in slavery. And even while they were in slavery, they were doing things that created wealth and made this country better. In part, I have a belief that the country can be better because I have seen that history, which shows it can become better. And I have lived through times when it has become better, and I have participated in struggles that have helped make it better. There is a glimmer of hope that the unity and sense of community that has escaped African Americans for so long will be recaptured by this small but influential band of professional athletes who occupy such a prominent position in contemporary culture, not merely in the United States but throughout the world. There is a hope that a new generation of athletes will use its popularity, wealth, and influence to create a desperately needed economy for the vast majority of African Americans who sit on the periphery of society. The evolution from being a lost tribe to $40 million slaves to completely free men and women is realizing that racism is more virulent and determined than ever before. The reality is that from Tom Molyneux to LeBron James, challenges have changed, but the struggle continues. There is no one promised land, but a succession of promised lands. And there's hope in that because, as every athlete knows, as long as you struggle, as long as you keep up a fight, no victory is impossible. End of $40 Million Slaves by William C. Rhoden.